Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had one of the craziest ends of all time. In 1943, he was removed from power by his own government and arrested, but Germany rescued him and made him the puppet leader of a small area in northern Italy called the Republic of Salo. By 1945, however, the partisans, which were Italian resistance fighters, along with the support of the Allies, were advancing into northern Italy, and the collapse of the Salo Republic was imminent. Mussolini and his woman, Clara Petacci, decided to secretly flee to Switzerland, where they planned to catch a plane to Spain, where Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator, was still in power. 2 days later, though, while they were near Lake Como, they were stopped by communist partisans named Valerio and Bellini, and then identified by the political commissar Urbano Lazzaro. According to a previously signed document, they were supposed to hand over Mussolini to the United Nations, but the next day, Mussolini and Petacci were both quickly shot. The shootings took place in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra and were conducted by a partisan leader whose real identity is still unknown, even though most think it was Walter Audicio. On the 29th of April 1945, the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were loaded into a van and moved south to Milan. They dumped their bodies on the ground in Piazzale Loreto, and after being kicked and spat upon, the bodies were put upside down from the roof of a service station. The civilians from below threw stones. Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu, whose government in Romania was considered one of the most repressive in the Eastern Bloc, met a brutal end. In 1989, the Romanian Revolution, an uprising by the Romanian people against the communist regime, was underway. The final straw came on December 17th, when the police and military opened fire on an anti-government demonstration. By December 20th, even though the press was completely censored, word began spreading through word of mouth and anti-communist radio broadcasts. Ceausescu decided to hold a mass rally the next day, December 21st, in what is now Revolution Square. At first, it looked like just another one of his speeches. He blamed the previous riots on fascist agitators trying to destroy socialism, but Ceausescu had misread the crowd's mood. About 8 minutes into his speech, people began booing and shouting. He tried to calm them by raising his right hand and calling for silence, and order was briefly restored. Eventually, however, he lost control of the crowd and fled inside the building. Bucharest erupted in open revolt, but the military quickly took control, clearing the streets by midnight and arresting hundreds. By the next morning, the rebellion had spread to all major cities. Vasil Milea, Ceausescu's defense minister, unalived himself. Believing he had been murdered, almost all of the soldiers switched sides and joined the revolution. Ceausescu made one last desperate attempt to address the crowd gathered in front of the Central Committee building, but people began throwing stones and other stuff at him, forcing him to retreat inside once again. He and his wife, Elena, escaped to the roof and managed to flee by helicopter, just seconds ahead of the demonstrators who had reached the top floor. However, they were ordered to land by the army, which had restricted all air traffic by that point. Ceausescu and his wife were detained by police, who reportedly listened to updates on the revolution by radio. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989, the Ceausescus were tried by a military court and sentenced to death. Ceausescu repeatedly denied the court's authority and insisted he was still the legal president of Romania, but it made no difference. The couple was executed by firing squad, riddled with more than 100 bullets in seconds. Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese prime minister during World War II, met a terrible end. After Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur ordered the arrest of 40 individuals suspected of war crimes, including Tojo. 5 American soldiers were sent to arrest him, but when they surrounded his house on September 11th, Tojo shot himself in the chest with a pistol, but he missed his heart. As he bled, Tojo began to speak, and 2 Japanese reporters recorded his words. He said, "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die. The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I am very sorry for the nation and all the races of the greater Asiatic powers. I wait for the righteous judgment of history. I wish to commit unalivement, but sometimes that fails." However, the American soldiers managed to resuscitate him and brought him to Sugamo prison in Tokyo. From there, he was put on trial and found guilty of multiple war crimes. He was sentenced to death and hanged on December 23, 1948, just a week before his 64th birthday. In his final statement, he apologized for the atrocities committed by the Japanese military and asked the American military to show compassion toward the Japanese people, who had suffered devastating air raids and 2 atomic bombings. Kim Jong-il. By the late 2000s, rumors about Kim Jong-il's health were flying around like crazy. Some reports even claimed he had died years earlier and was being replaced by body doubles. Some pointed to his absence from public events, like the 2008 Olympic torch relay in Pyongyang, to back that up. In September 2008, Kim missed a big military parade, and U.S. intelligence thought he might have suffered a stroke. North Korean media didn't say much, but behind the scenes, things looked serious. Japanese and South Korean sources suggested Kim had collapsed, was partially paralyzed, and needed help from foreign doctors. At one point, North Korea even told all its diplomats to stay close to their embassies, just in case there was an important message coming. Despite all the drama, North Korea released photos and videos showing Kim in good health. But analysts weren't convinced, and some reports said he'd had a second stroke. Still, he managed to hold on to power, kept appearing in public, and even took a few foreign trips in 2010 and 2011, including visits to China and Russia, sometimes with his youngest son Kim Jong-un at his side, which made people think he was prepping him as a successor. Then, on December 17, 2011, North Korean state media announced that Kim Jong-il had died of a suspected heart attack while traveling by train. The announcement came with some wild claims. A snowstorm supposedly paused, the sky glowed red over Mount Paektu, and ice on a sacred lake cracked so loudly it shook heaven and earth, according to North Korean media. Afterward, Kim Jong-il was posthumously declared North Korea's eternal leader. Joseph Stalin. In his later years, Stalin was in poor health, so much so that in 1950 and again in 1951, he spent almost 5 months on holiday at his Abkhazian dacha. Just as he did with his political allies, Stalin showed paranoia and mistrusted his doctors. In January 1952, for example, he had one imprisoned after they suggested he should retire to improve his health. He even started the Doctors' Plot, in which doctors were falsely accused of plotting to assassinate top Soviet leaders. On the 1st of March 1953, Stalin's staff found him semi-conscious on the bedroom floor of his Kuntsevo dacha. He was moved onto a couch and remained there for 3 days, during which he was hand-fed with a spoon and given various medicines and injections. His condition, however, kept deteriorating until he died on the 5th of March. An autopsy revealed that he had died of a cerebral hemorrhage and that his cerebral arteries had been severely damaged by atherosclerosis, a disease that damages the arteries. When his body was displayed, the crowds coming to view it were so large and disorganized that many people were killed in a crowd crush. His death, however, was not free from conspiracy theories. Some believed he had been intentionally poisoned or allowed to die by members of his inner circle, most notably Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the Soviet secret police. Pol Pot. By the late 90s, things were falling apart for Pol Pot, the man behind Cambodia's brutal regime. In June 1997, he had his longtime comrade Sun Sen assassinated, along with 13 of Sen's family members and aides. Pol Pot later claimed he didn't order all of those killings, but by then, trust inside the Khmer Rouge was pretty much gone. One of the top commanders, Ta Mok, figured he might be next on Pol Pot's hit list, so he made the first move. He rallied his loyal troops, accused Pol Pot of betraying their cause, and forced him to flee. Pol Pot, by this point, was so frail he had to be carried. However, he didn't get far. Mok's troops caught him and put him under house arrest. While confined, Pol Pot gave his final interview to American journalist Nate Thayer. He claimed his conscience was clear and insisted he acted for his country, not for power. He downplayed the genocide, saying millions was too high a number. In July, Khmer Rouge leaders held a big meeting and publicly sentenced Pol Pot to life in prison. However, on April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died in his sleep. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack. But Thayer, who was there at the time, believed Pol Pot had taken his own life with a mix of Valium and chloroquine right after learning that Ta Mok planned to hand him over to the US. Saddam Hussein. After being accused by George Bush of possessing weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein's country, Iraq, was invaded by a US-led coalition in 2003. The Iraqi government and military collapsed within 3 weeks of the invasion, and by early April, coalition forces occupied much of the country. When Baghdad fell to US-led forces on April 9th, symbolized by the toppling of Saddam's statue, he was nowhere to be found, and his regime had been completely overthrown. To aid in capturing regime officials, the US military issued the most wanted Iraqi playing cards, with Saddam as the ace of spades and his sons as other high-ranking cards. Bounties were also placed on their heads, $15 million for each son and $25 million for Saddam. He remained in hiding until December, when a soldier noticed a rope partially buried near a small hut. Pulling it revealed a styrofoam-covered trapdoor leading to a spider hole. Saddam Hussein emerged and surrendered, reportedly saying, "My name is Saddam Hussein. I am the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate." He was arrested and held at US military bases until November 5, 2006, when he was found guilty of crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Despite requesting to be executed by firing squad, arguing it was more fitting given his position as commander-in-chief, his request was denied. Saddam was executed by hanging on December 30, 2006, and the footage was put online from a leaked, secretly recorded cell phone video. Francisco Franco. By the early 1970s, Francisco Franco, Spain's long-ruling dictator, was clearly nearing the end of his life. He'd already started preparing for what came next, officially naming Prince Juan Carlos as his successor in 1969, and after a long illness, Franco died on the 20th of November, 1975, at the age of 82. The date was symbolic, as it happened to fall on the 39th anniversary of the death of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, founder of the fascist Falange movement. Some even say Franco might have died the evening before, on the 19th, but the official announcement came later. Juan Carlos was officially proclaimed King of Spain, setting the stage for the country's eventual transition to democracy. In 2019, over 40 years after his funeral, Spain's socialist government ordered his exhumation. The idea was that only Civil War victims should be buried in the Valley of the Fallen, and keeping Franco there was seen as deeply disrespectful to those buried alongside him. His family objected, but the government chose Mingarubio Cemetery in El Pardo as his final resting place. Since he was banned from using the Spanish flag, Franco's grandson draped the coffin in a nationalist flag instead. Josip Broz Tito. In the final years of his life, Tito started stepping back from the day-to-day duties of running Yugoslavia. After 1974, he passed more responsibility to the prime minister, though he still had the final say on all big decisions. But by 1979, his health took a serious downturn. He was struggling with circulation problems in his legs and was admitted twice in January 1980 to a hospital in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Doctors said his left leg needed to be amputated due to blocked arteries, but Tito flat out refused. In fact, his personal aide said Tito threatened to unalive himself if anyone dared to take his leg, so they literally hid his pistol out of fear he might go through with it. Eventually, after a private talk with his sons, Tito gave in. The leg was amputated, but it was too late. The infection had already spread, and on May 4th, 1980, Tito died at the age of 87. His death was a massive event. 129 countries sent leaders to his funeral, making it the biggest state funeral ever at the time. Kings, presidents, prime ministers from both sides of the Cold War came to the funeral. Augusto Pinochet. On the morning of December 3, 2006, Augusto Pinochet, Chile's former dictator, suffered a heart attack. His house arrest was lifted, and on December 10th, Pinochet was rushed to the intensive care unit. Just a few hours later, he died from congestive heart failure and pulmonary edema. He was 91 years old, surrounded by his family in the military hospital of Santiago. The news were polarizing. In Santiago, thousands of people flooded the streets, some to celebrate, others to mourn. His body was laid out the next day at the military academy. But even then, things didn't stay peaceful. Francisco Cuadrado Prats, the grandson of a general murdered under Pinochet's regime, spat on the coffin and was beaten by furious supporters. Mao Zedong. In the last years of his life, Mao Zedong was in rough shape. He was a heavy chain smoker, and behind closed doors, the government kept his declining health a closely guarded secret. It turns out he was battling all kinds of serious illnesses, heart and lung issues, and maybe even Parkinson's and ALS, though those are unconfirmed. In 1976, things took a turn for the worse. Mao suffered a heart attack in March, another in late June, and then a third one on September 2nd that left him completely incapacitated. He never recovered and died a week later, on September 9, 1976, at the age of 82. When his embalmed body was shown to the public, 1 million people filed past to say goodbye. Even though Mao had asked to be cremated, that request was ignored. Instead, his body was permanently put on display in a mausoleum, so the Chinese people could continue to pay their respects. Fidel Castro. In the summer of 2006, Fidel Castro, the face of the Cuban Revolution, fell seriously ill with intestinal bleeding and had to undergo emergency surgery. For the first time in decades, he handed over power, temporarily at first, to his brother Raúl Castro. Over the next couple of years, Fidel slowly faded from the front lines of government. In 2008, he officially stepped down, saying it wouldn't be right to accept a job that required more energy than he could give. Raúl took over as president, but made sure Fidel would still be consulted on big decisions. Over time, though, his health declined. The government kept quiet about the details, though there were rumors he had diverticulitis, and he was clearly growing weaker. Then, on the night of November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died in Havana at the age of 90. The cause of death wasn't disclosed. As an interesting fact, he previously survived over 600 assassination attempts. Adolf Hitler. By early 1945, Adolf Hitler's world was collapsing. The Soviet Union's Red Army was pushing in from the east, the Western Allies from the west, and Germany itself was in ruins. Still, Hitler refused to give up. He clung to increasingly delusional hopes, like launching a surprise counterattack in the Ardennes, or counting on the US and Britain to suddenly turn against the Soviets after Roosevelt's death in April. None of it worked. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler made one final appearance above ground at the Reich Chancellery Garden, giving out medals to teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth. It was his last look at daylight. The Soviets were closing in fast, and by April 23rd, Berlin was fully surrounded. Over the next week, Hitler holed up in the Führer bunker, his underground command center. Reports from the front were catastrophic. His military leaders were either disobeying orders, fleeing, or, like Himmler and Göring, trying to negotiate surrender behind his back. Feeling betrayed, Hitler had Himmler declared a traitor and had Göring removed from power. On the night of April 28th, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a quick civil ceremony inside the bunker. The next day, he learned that Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. Hitler was determined to avoid the same fate. So when on April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops were just 1,640 feet away, Hitler unalived himself by pointing his pistol to his head. Eva bit into a cyanide capsule. In keeping with his instructions, their bodies were carried up to the garden, doused in gasoline, and set on fire as artillery shells exploded nearby. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, briefly took over, but committed unalivement the next day. Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. Hitler's dental remains were the only pieces ever positively identified, and it wasn't until 1956 that a German court officially issued a death certificate for Hitler. Let me know if you'd like a part 2. There are a few I didn't include because they're less well known, but they're even crazier. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.